Imagine the tableau of a perfect wedding day. The air is thick with the scent of expensive lilies. The lighting is curated to a warm cinematic amber. And the guests are all wearing the same performative smile, as if they are background actors in a high-budget fairy tale. The vows are exchanged with practiced clarity, hitting every emotional beat. Everyone applauds at precisely the right moments, convinced they are witnessing the triumphant beginning of a happily ever after. But if you lean in closer, past the silk and the champagne, you might notice something chilling. Look at the person standing at the altar. Ignore the curve of their lips and look into the void behind their eyes. There is a specific, haunting brand of silence that inhabits the mind of someone about to bind their life to a person they do not truly love. This isn't a peaceful silence or a moment of zen. It is a violent suppression. It is the sound of a cold, rational mind placing its boot on the neck of a screaming heart. We have been spoon-fed a specific narrative since childhood, that love is the inevitable precursor to marriage, and marriage is the ultimate gateway to fulfillment. But for millions, the reality is far more transactional. For them, marriage isn't a celebration of passion. It is a fortress of stability, a desperate grab for security, or a surrender to the relentless ticking of a social clock. It is the choice of the person who makes the most sense on paper because the existential terror of being alone has become heavier than the fear of being unloved. The tragedy is that from the outside, it looks like you've finally made it. But from the inside, it feels like you've just committed spiritual suicide. Why do brilliant, self-aware individuals walk into this gilded cage? Why do we tether our souls to people who spark no joy, no fire, and no resonance within us? To answer this, we must dismantle the grandest myth society has ever sold. The idea that love is the historical bedrock of marriage. For the vast majority of human history, marriage was never a romantic milestone. It was a cold-blooded contract. It was a strategic alliance used to consolidate land, secure tribal status, and ensure the survival of a lineage. Love as a prerequisite is a modern luxury, a fragile expectation that emerged only when our lives became safe enough and long enough to afford the luxury of feeling. Yet, even in our hyper-modern world of 2026, those ancient, primal survival instincts are still hardwired into our nervous systems. Psychology identifies several potent forces that drive people into these hollow unions, and one of the most insidious is anuptophobia, the chronic, paralyzing fear of remaining single. You may not hear that term in casual conversation, but you have undoubtedly felt its shadow. It is the sound of that invisible social clock, ticking with judgy precision in the background of every family gathering. By 30, you should be settled. By 35, you should be a parent. By 40, you should have erected a life that proves you weren't discarded by the world. As these arbitrary deadlines loom, panic begins to cannibalize your standards. Your brain stops optimizing for joy and starts minimizing for risk. The search for a soulmate is abandoned in favor of a recruitment process for a reliable candidate. In this state of quiet desperation, the criteria for a life partner undergo a radical and tragic shift. You stop asking, "Does this person wake up my soul?" and start asking, "Are they financially solvent? Are they loyal? Will my parents approve of their resume?" Logic becomes a weapon used against your own intuition. You tell yourself that while there is no spark, there is safety. And for many, safety is a more addictive drug than passion. This is especially true for those whose early lives were defined by the jagged edges of chaos, poverty, or emotional neglect. When you have spent your formative years in survival mode, romance feels like a frivolous garnish you cannot afford. You don't crave a love story. You crave a sanctuary. A human fortress against the terrifying unpredictability of existence. Then there is the value alignment trap, a phenomenon that masquerades as maturity. You find someone who shares your spreadsheets on life, same views on debt, same political leanings, same religious upbringing. You function like a high-performance corporate team. You don't fight because there isn't enough friction to create a spark. Your mind negotiates a ceasefire with your heart, arguing that love will surely grow in such fertile, logical soil. But love is not a weed that grows just because you provide water. It is a wild thing that often refuses to inhabit the structures we build for it. What looks like maturity from the balcony is, in reality, the opening chapter of a long, silent exile from your own emotions. To truly grasp the gravity of why a person would surrender their life to a loveless union, we have to look beneath the surface of logic and into the deep, murky waters of the human subconscious. Most people aren't choosing a partner based on a conscious checklist. They are being guided by a hidden engine known in psychology as attachment theory. This is the primal blueprint your brain constructed in the cradle, a map that dictates what love is supposed to feel like, what it costs to maintain, and what kind of treatment you deserve. When adulthood arrives, many of us aren't actually looking for a connection. We are looking for familiarity. We are attracted to the shadows of our past, even if those shadows are cold. For someone with an anxious attachment style, love is never a peaceful harbor. It is a turbulent sea of uncertainty. They have been conditioned to believe that affection is a prize to be earned or a fleeting ghost to be chased. When they encounter someone stable, consistent, and perhaps a bit dull, it doesn't feel like boredom. It feels like salvation. They aren't asking if their heart beats faster when that person enters the room. They are simply relieved that for the first time in their life, they aren't being abandoned. They mistake the absence of anxiety for the presence of love, not realizing that a cage is still a cage, even if the bars are made of gold. And stability. Conversely, for those with an avoidant attachment style, the trap is built on the fear of being seen. Real, raw intimacy is not a goal. It is a threat. To be truly known is to be vulnerable to total destruction. Therefore, they unconsciously gravitate toward partners they do not fully love. Because a lukewarm connection acts as a buffer. It provides the social status of marriage without the terrifying emotional stakes of a deep soul bond. They get the companionship, the tax benefits, and the shared bed, but they never have to hand over the keys to their innermost self. And then there's the devastating impact of developmental trauma. If you grew up amidst the wreckage of unpredictability or emotional absence, your internal radar is permanently broken. Your brain begins to mislabel the signals your body is sending. You might mistake the high-octane drama of a toxic relationship for chemistry. Or worse, you might mistake the quiet, healthy pulse of real love for boredom. By the time you stand at the altar, you are making a lifelong commitment under the heavy influence of a past you haven't healed from. You aren't choosing a spouse. You are choosing a coping mechanism. You opt for what feels manageable and what feels like control, only to realize too late that control is a very poor substitute for a heartbeat. Let us be painfully, brutally honest. The most dangerous thing about settling is that it rarely looks like a mistake in the beginning. In the early stages, it wears the mask of wisdom. It looks like you've finally grown up and put away childish things like passion and sparks. It looks like you're being the responsible adult that your family and society always wanted you to be. But how do you discern the difference between a mature, quiet love and a soul-crushing compromise? How do you know if you are building a life or merely decorating a prison cell? There are 7 visceral signs that you are settling, even if your mind is working overtime to gaslight you into staying. The first sign is that relief feels exponentially stronger than excitement. When they propose, or when you say, "I do," you don't feel a surge of joy. You feel a weight lifting off your shoulders because you no longer have to. Explain why you're single. The second sign is somatic. Your body begins to reject them. You can't explain why, but their touch feels like a chore, and their kiss feels like a performance you're tired of rehearsing. The third sign is a chilling one. You feel a profound sense of lightness when they are not in the room. This isn't the healthy space required in a relationship. It's the feeling of your nervous system finally being allowed to breathe because the pressure to act in love has temporarily subsided. The fourth sign is the internal lock. You realize you are keeping your truest self, your darkest fears, your wildest dreams, your most eccentric jokes, tucked away in a private vault. You don't share them because you know they wouldn't resonate. Or worse, they would be met with a blank stare. Fifth, the future doesn't look like a landscape of possibility. It looks like a long, gray hallway with no windows. It's stable, yes, but it's utterly devoid of color. Sixth, The relationship has devolved into pure logistics. You are world-class experts at managing the mortgage, the groceries, and the kids' schedules. But you are total strangers to each other's inner worlds. Everything works, but nothing feels. And finally, the seventh sign. You find yourself fantasizing not necessarily about a specific other person, but about a different version of you. You crave the version of yourself that felt alive, the version that wasn't shrinking or numbing out just to keep the peace. If you see your reflection in these points, it doesn't mean you are a failure. It means your body is telling the truth that your mind is too afraid to utter. That love isn't just a contract of compatibility. It is the vital electricity of being seen. If your marriage requires you to disappear, it isn't a partnership. It's an emotional disappearance act. Once the echoes of the wedding march have faded, the champagne has gone flat, and the just married filters have been archived on social media, a quiet but terrifying phenomenon begins to take root. Reality descends like a heavy fog. For the person who married without the foundation of genuine love, the first psychological battlefield is not an external conflict with their spouse, but a brutal internal war with their own psyche. In psychology, we call this cognitive dissonance, the excruciating mental tension that arises when a person is forced to hold two diametrically opposed truths at once. Truth A: I have stood before my community and pledged to cherish this person until my final breath. Truth B: my heart feels absolutely nothing when they walk through the door. This internal schism creates a psychological pressure cooker, and the brain, desperate to alleviate the discomfort of living a lie, begins to construct elaborate, sophisticated defense mechanisms. You start to pathologize passion, calling it childish or unstable. You convince yourself that chemistry is a Hollywood myth designed to sell movie tickets, and that real love is nothing more than duty, shared taxes, and the endurance of monotony. For a while, the narrative holds. But while the mind is an expert at self-deception, the body is an honest witness that refuses to believe the story you are telling. The silence of a loveless marriage eventually manifests in physical and emotional symptoms that no amount of logic can suppress. It starts as a persistent tightness in the chest, an inexplicable irritability over the sound of your partner's breathing, or a profound emotional numbness that bleeds into every other area of your life. This leads to the most agonizing form of isolation known to the human experience: loneliness within a marriage. Most people erroneously believe that loneliness is the result of being alone, but the most corrosive loneliness occurs when you are sitting mere inches away from another human being, and yet realize you have no one to truly reach. This is the loneliness of the unshared self, when you cannot reveal your vulnerabilities, your absurd humor, or your deepest anxieties. Because there is no emotional resonance between you begin to amputate parts of yourself to fit the narrow confines of the relationship. Little by little, you shrink. Your conversations become purely transactional, a series of administrative check-ins about bills, household chores, and the children's extracurricular schedules. There is no hostility, no dramatic screaming matches, just a hollow, echoing void where a connection should be. This is how a marriage can appear perfectly functional on a curated Instagram feed, while in reality, one person is slowly vanishing into the shadows of their own home. What many fail to understand is that you cannot simply logic your way out of the stress a loveless union places on your nervous system. Even if your partner is a saint, even if they are loyal, kind, and provide a comfortable lifestyle, your body still registers the lack of emotional intimacy as a form of chronic deprivation. Emotional starvation is a stressor that never sleeps. When you live for years without the nutrients of being seen and understood, your nervous system adapts in two primary damage ways. It either stays in a state of hypervigilant activation, or it begins to shut down entirely. Some people become chronically anxious, restless, and hypersensitive to the smallest inconveniences. Their sleep cycles shatter, their appetite fluctuates, and their mind becomes a racetrack for what-if scenarios. Others descend into what psychologists call functional depression. You still wake up, you still excel at your job, you still smile for the family photos, but the internal lights have gone out. You lose your sense of wonder, your curiosity, and the vibrant colors of your personality fade into a permanent shade of gray. You start to believe that this hollow existence is simply what adulthood feels like. But you are wrong. This isn't maturity. It is your body keeping the score for a love that was promised but never delivered. When a fundamental human need for connection goes unmet, the brain doesn't just accept the vacuum. It begins a desperate search for substitutes. The hunger for intimacy doesn't evaporate just because you signed a legal document. It simply goes underground. People typically cope through three common yet tragic avenues. The first is indifference, the path of emotional fossilization. You lower your expectations to zero, stop hoping for romance, and treat the marriage like a roommate agreement. It is peaceful, but it is the peace of a cemetery. The second is displacement. You pour your untapped life force into work, becoming addicted to professional success as a surrogate for personal fulfillment. Or you make your children the absolute center of your emotional universe. You don't just parent them, you use them to fill the void, creating an unhealthy dependency known as parentification. The third and most misunderstood path is seeking. This isn't necessarily about being unfaithful in the traditional sense. It is the frantic search of a starving person for a crumb of validation. It manifests as a fixation on old flames, an obsession with romantic fiction, or emotional affairs with colleagues, where a single genuine conversation feels like a torrential rain in desert. These aren't always bad people. They are malnourished souls trying to feel a pulse before they forget what it feels like to be alive. If the internal landscape of a loveless marriage is a desert, then the question inevitably arises, why not simply leave? To an observer, the solution seems elementary. If the fire has gone out and the air has turned cold, you walk out the door. However, through the lens of psychology, exiting a loveless union is not a simple binary decision. It is the total collapse of a carefully constructed identity. Once you have invested years of your life, combined your finances, garnered the approval of your social circle, and perhaps brought children into the world, your brain begins to play a brutal psychological trick known as the sunk cost fallacy. This cognitive bias convinces you that because you have already paid such a high price in time and emotion, you must stay to justify the investment, lest all that suffering be for nothing. The longer you remain, the more the exit fee seems to rise, until the truth feels too heavy to speak aloud. Then comes the corrosive influence of shame. Not the loud public shame of a scandal, but a quiet, rhythmic pulse of unworthiness. It is the shame of feeling ungrateful for a good life, the fear of breaking sacred vows, and the terror of being the person who simply couldn't make it work. Perhaps the most formidable chain keeping people tethered to a loveless bed is the sentence, "I'm staying for the children." While the desire to provide a stable two-parent household is noble, psychology suggests a more complex and potentially damaging reality. Children do not merely learn about relationships from what you tell them. They absorb the emotional frequency of the home like sponges. When a household is emotionally refrigerated, children normalize that lack of warmth. They grow up observing a blueprint where love is something to be tolerated, managed, or survived, rather than experienced as a source of joy. They see a version of intimacy that is hollow and transactional, and they often carry that damaged map into their own adult lives. In many such families, a phenomenon called parentification occurs, where a child is unconsciously drafted to fill the emotional void left by the spouse. The child becomes the confidant, the source of meaning, and the primary companion for the unloved parent. The marriage may stay intact on paper, but the emotional cost is a debt passed down like an inheritance, forcing the next generation to pay for the parent's silence. Ultimately, every loveless marriage eventually reaches a definitive fork in the road. Contrary to the popular belief that there are only two endings, divorce or misery, psychology suggests there are actually three distinct outcomes. The first is the companionate marriage. This is the path of radical acceptance, where both partners acknowledge the absence of romantic fire and consciously decide to build a life based on something else. Mutual respect, effective teamwork, and shared history. It isn't the stuff of poetry, but it can be stable, functional, and even occasionally comforting. For some, this partnership of peace is a trade-off they are willing to make. The second outcome is silent hell. This is the darkest trajectory, where unmet needs rot into resentment, and resentment eventually curdles into contempt. Every minor habit, the way they chew, the sound of their voice, the way they exist in the room, becomes a trigger for a visceral, suppressed rage. The home becomes a theater of passive aggression, and the psyche begins to fragment under the weight of constant, low-level hostility. The third and quietest tragedy is the parallel life. In this scenario, there are no grand explosions or courtroom dramas. There are simply two strangers living in the same house, moving like ghosts through a shared space, but inhabiting entirely different worlds. They are two separate solitudes under one roof, but there is a vital warning sign that dictates which path you are on. If respect has died, silent hell is your inevitable destination. You can survive a marriage without passion, but you cannot survive a marriage without respect. If you recognize yourself in these words, you are faced with two paths that both require a terrifying level of courage. Roadmap A is to stay and rebuild. Not through pretending, but through a radical, honest dismantling of the current structure. It requires professional intervention, truth conversations that strip away the masks, and the agonizing work of relearning intimacy from the ground up. Roadmap B is to leave with dignity. If the relationship has devolved into numbness or emotional harm, leaving is not an act of failure. It is an act of self-preservation. It involves building a foundation of stability and giving yourself the grace to grieve the life you thought you were supposed to have. Because at the end of the day, life is far too short to be together and yet remain completely invisible.